All right, so everyone, welcome to Archeo Viking. Today we have a special guest, Laura Martinez, who is an indigenous historian, specifically Wapan Apache, who specializes in the history of the indigenous peoples of the Southwest. And I have brought her here today to help this video about the Apache Wars. Because as I have done movies about various parts of the Indian Wars in the past on the East Coast, something which I'm very knowledgeable on, I am not as knowledgeable on these events. So I've brought my co-host Laura Martinez here because it is her specialty. So with that, Laura, why don't you give us a little background on the history of the Apache before the beginning of the U.S. Apache Wars?
Okay, so a lot of times people think of Apache as one big tribe, like the Navajo or the Lakota or the Cherokee or whatever. But the Apache, as you can see on the map here, are several tribes. There's the Wapan Apache, which is where I come from. There are Plains Apache, Oklahoma Apache, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Chiricahua, White Mountain. Now, those are all lumped in under Western Apache here, but there's, White Mountain, San Carlos. So there are actually several Apache tribes, and part of the reason for that is because our tribes were nomadic. And a lot of people think nomad just means wandering aimlessly, but it does not. Nomadic tribes had a set path where we were going. We followed herds. Plains Apache and Wapan Apache were buffalo hunters, whereas the more Western groups did not hunt buffalo as much, if at all. But we were nomadic tribes historically. And so the different tribes were different nomadic groups. And even within each tribe, there were smaller clans or bands within there that were the different smaller traveling groups that would meet up seasonally for ceremony or feasts or those kind of things. So the different Apache tribes, while they are different tribes, they are linguistically and culturally linked, but they are different tribes. And in the case of my own tribe, we never even had one singular chief over all the Wapan Apache. We've always historically had multiple chiefs. And that's the case for other Apache tribes as well. There would be multiple chiefs over the different bands within the tribe.
Okay. And was there different degrees of nomadism between different tribes, the different tribes, or were they all the same, or like which essentially, that what was the were they all the same amount of nomadic? Because like some for example, I've done work in Mongolia. In some parts of Mongolia, some people in some regions are more nomadic than others. So was there some of that going on, or?
We were all nomadic. There on this map though is a little misleading because there was definitely some overlap into where our ancestors traveled, like the Wapan area spread up into the Mescalero area and down into the Rio Grande Valley and overlapped with the Carrizo. So there was some overlap in the different areas.
Okay.
So this map is a little misleading because while it is accurate as to where the different homelands for each group is, they were a little more spread out because there was a little overlap and there was a little more space traveled. But it was all about not only following the herds, but I can't think of the word off the top of my head. Rather than agriculture, what our ancestors practiced was, I can't think of the word. If you know it, say it.
I believe it is horticulture.
Yes, where we would do things to the land to, like pruning back certain bushes and things like that to help the land produce more food, so that when you came by the same place every year, this particular bush would have more berries on it, or this cactus would have more fruit on it. So our traditional foods included not only the meat that was hunted, but things like acorns, cactus, berries, of course, nuts, those kind of things. And we would do things to help those things produce more food. So it wasn't just wandering aimlessly and just eating what we could find. It was very intentional in how it was done.
Okay. And before we move on to the beginning of the Apache Wars, what were the relationships, be it antagonistic, which I'm sure there was some of that, friendly or what have you, between the various Apache tribes and the other surrounding tribes, such as the ancestral Puebloans, if you have stories of them, the Hohokam, etc. What were the relations between tribes like, between other cultures?
Prior to European arrival, we got along very well with the ancestral Puebloan people. We would trade with them, we would feast with them. That's how we got our corn. We didn't grow our own corn. The reason why blue corn is the traditional corn for Apache people and for Navajo people, which Apache and Navajo used to be one group and they split off, and I know the ancient stories about that. But prior to that, we got along with the Puebloan people, and we traded with them. So the reason why blue corn is our traditional corn is because that was their traditional corn. And we would trade for corn, and we would, since it was something we could carry with us along traveling. And after European arrival and people getting pushed out of their homelands and people getting shuffled around, that's when Apache raiding started, which we're really well known for raiding. So after that was when raiding for supplies, for corn, for that kind of thing happened. We did not get along with the Comanche at all. There's even still a bit of a rivalry between Apache and Comanche. It was really meaningful during, in 2016, during Standing Rock, when the Apache and Comanche entered Standing Rock together. Because if you weren't Apache or Comanche, you would not understand the significance of that, because there's even still a little bit of bad blood between the two tribes. So it wasn't until after European arrival, because the Comanche, their homelands were originally further north, they got pushed south into our homelands, and that's where the fighting between them started. Fun little fact here. One of the things that my ancestors used to do was, because the Spanish were building missions. Well, they weren't building them; they were enslaving my ancestors and forcing them to build them, and then enslaving my ancestors in the missions. What they would do was they would dress like Comanche and then attack the Spanish, so that the Spanish would think the Comanche attacked them and retaliate against the Comanche. So that's a little fun fact for you there. But so prior to European arrival, there were, of course, groups that we didn't get along with, but our relationship with the Pueblo people was actually a very good relationship. And it wasn't after the Europeans came that the raiding started and those relationships went sour.
Okay. All right. That's very interesting. And that makes a lot of sense. Because when you look at nomadic societies all around the world, not just in the Southwest, that's generally how nomadic societies get materials they don't need. They only raid when they have to. Historically, they would often, say in the case of the Mongolic tribes, they would trade with China and other places for their stuff, and then only raid if they didn't get the right amount of things they needed. Which, of course, is a little different from what you're describing, but humanity rhymes. Not every human culture is exactly the same, but humans think similar enough that it makes sense that similar ideas would have been come up with. So.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And yeah. So and there's archaeological evidence to support that. You know, the fact that Apaches and Navajos were invited to feasts with Puebloan people, and then they traded, that there would be like big events on trading days and stuff like that, as well as historical oral accounts, because we didn't have a written language. We still recorded our history in other ways, be it oral or petroglyphs, but, accounts back that up.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all very informing, and that's informed not just our viewers but me of a lot of information I didn't know about Apache history. Because again, most of my focus has always been on the East Coast with the Cherokee and the Yamasee and Tuscarora and Haudenosaunee and such. So, all right. So, while we're gonna start off the Apache Wars with essentially, why don't you tell us about the Apache Wars during the 1840s, as well as the effects of the Civil War, the American Civil War, on the Apache and the various tribes and battles and such? Because I do know that Kit Carson, a Union colonel, had a huge effect on the region during that time.
So, my knowledge with that is mostly in Texas with regards to my tribe. So if you've got more, go ahead and do that, and then I can talk a little bit more about my knowledge.
Okay, all right. Well, so essentially, from what I understand, specifically with how Texas influenced the region, Texas was always trying to, in the 1840s and eventually in the 1860s, was always trying to expand its territory out into the Southwest. They tried, the first time they really tried this in, I don't want to say an invasion, but it was what they thought of as an invasion. It's called the Santa Fe expedition. The Santa Fe expedition was in 1842, and essentially the idea was the Texas government was going to invade into Mexican territory and take Santa Fe and make it part of Texas territory. Unfortunately, that didn't work out that well. So what happened is they only had roughly 300 Texas Rangers that they commissioned for the thing, and then the rest of the 1,000 or so forces they had were mostly shopkeepers, cooks, barbers, etc. And they didn't hire very many trackers, if any. So they were going in blind and were constantly under attack from the various Apache and Navajo, and I don't know if any of the Utes or Paiute raided them either, but the point is they were constantly being harassed by various tribes. Before eventually getting to Santa Fe and finding a 2,000 to 3,000 man army there versus their now severely diminished, maybe 300 to 500 man army, and they promptly surrendered, and then were half of them were executed, and they were sent back saying never come back. And so that was essentially categorizes the effects of the wars there. Now there was and I'm probably going to butcher this, the Jarakia War or something like that, that also did happen, but it wasn't quite as big as what would eventually come, which was the Confederate expedition to essentially do the same thing the Santa Fe expedition was, where they marched into this territory that you see here on the map, with I think about 20,000 soldiers, under the idea that they were going to conquer all the way to California. Again, it didn't go well. They were constantly harassed by the Mescaleros Apaches, as well as the Chiricahua Apache and various other Apache tribes, as well as Navajo. And the U.S. military was able to defeat them. I did talk about the battle on my last video, but in a canyon. They defeated them in a canyon and permanently drove them out of the area. But what happened after that is, with the Confederacy now no longer able to enter the region, the Union decided to send Kit Carson after the Apaches, specifically the Mescaleros and the Navajos, and he forcibly rounded them all up and marched them to various forts and reservations, and it became known to people such as the Navajo as the Long Walk.
Yeah, the
Essentially,
long
their
walk.
essentially their version of the Trail of Tears, and I don't want to equate them because they have their own struggles that each one faced, but it's very similar into what happened, and Kent Carson was the reason behind that. And he did also try to capture other Apache, such as Magnus Coloradus and Cochise and such. He didn't really succeed, but but he did cause a lot of damage in the region. And he is the sole reason that the Navajos were, most of them were moved to the reservation. Of course, there were other Navajo chiefs who escaped, like Barbacito, who continued fighting until he eventually had to surrender decades later. But unfortunately, the whole area was depopulated thanks to Kit Carson. So
Right.
I'm gonna pass it off to you, Laura.
So in Texas, because Texas was one of the southern states during that time, there was basically an extermination campaign against Apaches. It was actually illegal to be Apache in the state of Texas.
Really?
So that's where the Day of Screams massacre comes in. There were orders from President Grant to, quote, leave the Apache in ashes. And so that's where the massacre of the Tall Grass Clan came in, which is my ancestors. People survived by hiding in brush, logs, whatever they could find, and playing dead, essentially. But, so there were survivors, but that's why you don't meet a lot of tall grass people. And so there were laws put into place that there was an actual extermination campaign. Well, if we can't, get rid of them this way, we're just going to exterminate them. Some of the Lapon of the Western bands, like the Rock Tied to Head people and a couple of the other bands, were moved west into eventually what became the Mescalero Reservation, which was later. But the rest of it was basically open season on Apaches. Bounty hunters, now, and this, we're talking, 1840s and 50s and 60s here. Bounty hunters could be paid $75 for the scalp of an Apache man, or $100 for a woman or child. The reason it was more for a woman or child is because women made more Apaches and little Apaches grew up to be big Apaches.
Yeah.
So it was basically open season on Apaches during that time period. Some people basically tried to assimilate into Mexican because, Texas was a part of Mexico. There were lots of Mexicans there. So some people survived by assimilating into Mexican society and pretending to be Mexican. A lot of us, most Apaches from my tribe, have Spanish last names. It wasn't super hard to do. And the reason we have Spanish last names is because long before that, when they built the missions, they made our ancestors pick last names off of a list and say, that's your new name. So sometimes brothers and sisters picked different names, which is why Apache genealogy is hard as fuck. So I'm sorry, I should not say that on your video.
That's perfectly fine. Yeah,
okay.
I guess too. So.
Okay, so Apache genealogy is hard as hell because sometimes brothers and sisters pick different last names because it was just like, okay, I'll be a Martinez. Okay, I'll be a Castro, whatever. It had no meaning to us. So anyway, a lot of us had Spanish last names. So some people did assimilate into Mexican society. One of my cousins actually was doing some research on his family and found out that one of his ancestors who did assimilate into Mexican society actually joined the Confederate Army. But another thing that our ancestors did was, because when the Spanish still controlled the area, we were enslaved. And then you see a shift towards the end of the 1700s that they shifted from enslaving Apaches, because we were the targets for enslavement, to enslaving African slaves.
Yeah.
And so you see this shift in the, they basically call it property logs, because that's how they viewed enslaved people. You see a shift of how many Apaches they had enslaved versus how many Africans they had enslaved. And those numbers of Apaches going down, the numbers of Africans going up. So because of the shared history, my ancestors also would hide runaway enslaved people. And for that reason, because we also had a lot of Lipan people taken to Louisiana as slaves. So because of that, we also would hide runaway people into our tribe. And due to that, we do have a lot of mixed Afro-Native people. So in that regard, during the Civil War, we were also trying to hide and help people who were enslaved or formerly enslaved and keep them safe as well. So it's a very interesting relationship with the government and with slavery and the Confederacy and all of that in Texas, because we had some Lapons who were assimilating in the Mexican society, some of whom joined the Confederate Army. We have some who were like, no, I'm Apache, and we're going to help these people because we have this shared history. We had some who were just being killed. So it was this very tumultuous time during that period.
Oh, and yeah, as it would be expected to be. So, all right. So, and after that, well, right around that time, was an event that I know a little about, but essentially the Bascom Affair, where, from what I understand, is a white, I forget if it was a boy or something along those lines, but essentially a white family was, with the name Bascom, was kidnapped by the Mescaleros, and no, sorry, yeah, Bascom was the general, but a white family was kidnapped by the Mescaleros, and so the Union Colonel Bascom confronted Cochise and Mangus Coloradus about the event, and asked them where were they. And from what I have heard, and it may be different accounts that you have heard, but from what I have heard, is that essentially Cochise said, well, I don't know where they are, but if you give me a few days, I can probably find them. But Bascom did not like that answer, and then tried to take Mangus Coloradus and Cochise hostage, and then they promptly cut themselves. The kind of heard is they cut themselves out of the tent and then rode off, and then started the war over this essentially breaking of treaty rights, as well as a forceful attempt to hold them captive for a crime they didn't commit. So is that correct information, or?
Yes, and I've seen the book that if we're talking about what I'm thinking about, there's a book written about their captivity.
Yeah, I haven't read that book, but I'm aware it exists. Yeah.
It's really so I've talked a lot about captivity narratives and how they were used as propaganda.
Yeah.
Captivity narratives follow a very, very set formula of the poor, innocent white people kidnapped by the savage Indians, and they go through some troubled times, and then by the grace of God, they're rescued. And they're almost allegorical biblically. And that captivity narrative, along with every single other captivity narrative, follows that formula.
Yeah.
So I don't recommend reading it, but I know of which affair you're speaking of, and yeah. So that instance sounds correct, and that captivity of those people, don't read their book.
Yeah, I think it's like In Search of the Apache Kid or something is the title of it, or something like that. Yeah, I haven't read it. I've been wary of it myself, but yeah.
Yeah, I always tell people not to bother with captivity narratives because they're propaganda, and that's what they were intentionally propaganda to make it like the native way of life was evil and savage, even as far back as one of the first captivity narratives was Mary Rowlandson.
Yeah.
And this was, I mean, we're talking 1600s here on the East Coast. And, that was one of the first ones, and all of the following ones followed that same formula. And they were intentional because, especially during the time of the early colonies, white people thought that viewed the native way of life as preferable to the way of life that they were living.
Yeah.
And they had to do a lot to keep white people from running away to live with the Indians, And so these captivity narratives kind of helped make it seem like the native way of life was somehow evil and savage, and you don't ever want to go with them because they'll murder and rape you and all of these terrible things.
Yeah.
And so that's why these books were written. And that book too, even though it's a much later text, was also written for the same reason.
Yeah. Okay. That pretty much checks out, which is always ironic, because then you have narratives like about Sam Houston, who loved living with the Cherokee and was adopted into the tribe, and his whole life was a pro native politician, that are in direct contrast to that. But unfortunately, you have those other narratives that are like, no, they were horrible, and he's like, no, they weren't. No, he's like, no, they weren't. So.
Yeah, and there's a great book, if you ever read it, called Shavato, and it's about Shavato. And he actually kidnapped, he captured, he was an army chief. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. It's been a minute since I've read that book, but it's a great book about a Lapon Apache man who actually was successful at capturing a U.S. Army chief.
Huh. Okay. Well, why don't you tell us about Cochise's and Mangus Coloradus' war against the U.S. Military, government, not military.
So Cochise is not one that I know a lot about. I know a lot more about the later ones.
Okay.
But how Cochise got his name.
Oh, really? How was that?
So, he would sell firewood, and in the Apache language, chi is like the word for firewood, and so white people would hear him saying that, and they started Cochise.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, and I know a little bit about it. I know at one point he gathered around 400 Apache and ambushed the U.S. military in a canyon, and they were able to hold their own until the U.S. brought the cannons in and drove them off. Though
that's one thing we're known for, is being really skilled at fighting in mountains and canyons.
Yeah, well, and of course they called it a U.S. victory, but I always question what events like that. Not just with the Indian Wars. Anytime somebody claims a victory, or it's just like, oh, we were getting slaughtered, and then we pulled out something, and then they ran off. Well, it's like, that doesn't sound like they lost. That just sounds like they just decided they were done, because that's how guerrilla warfare works. And that's essentially what this was, is they ambushed the U.S. Military and then caused as much damage as they could, and then left. And eventually, and Cochise also did not die in captivity. He died of old age. The war was still going on, and he died of old age. And unfortunately, later on, Mangus Coloradus was unfortunately sort of tricked into meeting what was supposed to be a peace delegation, and then when he got there, the U.S. soldiers inside the building killed him.
Unfortunately, I haven't studied Cochise as very much. I've studied a lot more of the later ones with like Geronimo and all of them. I have no reason. I just haven't studied Cochise and his wars as much as I have the other ones.
Okay, well, and that's and that's perfectly fine, because I do know a little bit about it. I know that this essentially reignited the Apache Wars, because there had been some lull for a few years before then, and this event sort of kicked it off. And actually, Geronimo, I believe, was a lieutenant of Mangus Coloradus and Cochise at one point in time. So it set them up, and so it never really ended after this. It just sort of kept going. After this,
our skills in fighting in mountains and the way that we are, the Apache technique of fighting and stalking. Now, I don't mean stalking like stalking and stalking, but like sneaking up, stalking, are taught by the U.S. military.
Okay.
They literally teach their soldiers Apache techniques because we're so good at it. Like, I was taught it as a small child. I'm not very good at it. I couldn't sneak up on anything, but I know how to do it.
Yeah, and I know how to do it too, though not from the Apache version. I take Wing Chun and ninjutsu, and we have similar ideas of how to position your body and how to move to not make sound. So I can definitely understand the ways you could do that. So, but yes, and then there, Cochise and Mangus Coloradus, I believe this is the canyon Apache Pass. This is the battle I was talking about, where they ambushed them in the canyon and caused as much damage as they could, which is a common guerrilla warfare tactic. Now, they didn't call it guerrilla warfare back then. Sort of like total war. Total war wasn't a term. Everyone likes to pull out total war, for example, with like Sherman. Total war wasn't a term that wasn't a term that was come up with till much later. He never coined it that, but it was. But that's essentially what it was. The U.S. military left Fort Buchanan and then eventually came into this pass, and Cochise and Mangus Coloradus were lying in wait, like any good guerrilla fighter would do, and ambush them and cause as much damage before leaving, and then continuing the fighting in the mountains for years before eventually Cochise died of old age, and Mangus Coloradus was tricked into that ambush, which unfortunately
has kind of always been our tactics.
Yeah, well, and unfortunately, it's sad to hear that happened to Mangus Coloradus, but it happens to the best of people. The war had been going on for years, and it's understandable that even the most staunch supporters of warfare sometimes have a change of heart if warfare goes on for longer than they expected. So there is that. And now then we also come to the Camp Grant Massacre, which is essentially it really sort of mirrors the Sand Creek Massacre with the Cheyenne, where essentially the U.S. military did what they're best at and ambushed a whole bunch of women and children at dawn and slaughtered them, and elderly as well. It was very common in the Indian Wars. Actually, I believe the Camp Grant Massacre was during the Civil War.
Yes, and it was a very tragic. I mean, not to say that some massacres are less tragic than others, but it was definitely a very tragic, really awful massacre.
Yeah, and it's and I believe, unlike the Sand Creek Massacre, which actually led to hearings and inquiries over it being a war crime, I believe the Camp Grant Massacre was praised, which is very unfortunate. So that shows how brutal this warfare was going. So that a massacre around the same time that was just as bloody was condemned, while this one was praised, which also shows the hypocrisy of the U.S. government.
Well, and also just really shows how they viewed Apaches in particular. Like if it had, and obviously this is speculative, but had it been a different tribe, they may not have treated it that way. But with it being Apaches, they want to get rid of those horrible, horrible Apaches. So, you know, they're going to do that.
Exactly. So, all right. So I'm gonna take over very briefly, okay. Because as our viewers, as our viewers know, usually when I do these collaboration videos on such broad subjects, I like to bring a little context in it. So okay. Essentially, what is going on here is I want to, while I don't want to take away from what happened in the Apache Wars, as this is the main subject of the videos, something I think is important to bring to the forefront is debunking the idea that it's a common idea that the U.S. did not become an imperial power until the time of Theodore Roosevelt and presidents like that. And while that certainly is when the U.S. became a fully fledged imperial power, the U.S. was always using the idea of manifest destiny, which wasn't just coast to coast. As in a previous video with my frequent co-host Ryan Dennison, and who's also a U.S. history teacher, mentions, it was also north to south. There were ambitions to go as far south as the very bottom tip of South America and the toppiest part of Canada, but it didn't stop there. Around this time, European imperial powers were beginning to exert their influence on various kingdoms and empires in the world, such as the subject of these images, China. So the square on the far left is the Opium War, and essentially what happened is Britain decided they weren't getting generous trade concessions from the Qing dynasty in China as they had wanted, and they demanded for China to open their gates. And when China refused, Britain invaded. Now, it's not what makes this situation different than previous similar situations, such as during Qinglong Emperor's time, is that in the previous years, China had actually been one of the most powerful nations in the world that had defeated Portugal and the Dutch Empire and Russia all through the course of 200 years, and had essentially at its height told Britain to fuck off, because Britain came in the 1790s in Qinglong Emperor's time and said, hey, give us more trade concessions. And Qinglong Emperor was like, yeah, no, leave now. But now, 50 years later, China had gone into decline. And ironically, the US was actually against Britain invading China. However, after Britain won the Opium War and got the Treaty of Nanjing signed, giving them generous trade concessions, the US decided, we want some too. And they promptly sent a delegation there and forced China to sign what was called the Treaty of Wang Jia, in which case we got equal trading rights to Britain. So that's one thing there. That's the hypocrisy that is always present in the U.S. government. You know, there's always that, oh, we're against this until it benefits us. You know, sort of like the whole idea of Indian removal was actually a decades-long affair, where it was like, oh, Thomas Jefferson, we can move them out west to the Louisiana Purchase. We're going to take it during the War of 1812. Well, that idea was always present here. And then after the success of the Opium War for Britain, the U.S. decided, hey, we're going to do it too. And they sent Commodore Perry with a fleet of ships to Japan, which had been in isolation for 200 years. For the most part, I want to preface that by saying that Japan was aware of the outside world. They were aware of somewhat of how technologically advanced the world was, and were aware of the Opium Wars going on. And they had already been discussing opening up their borders, but there was a lot of debate until the U.S. came along and told them open up or else. In 1858, led by Commodore Perry. And that's what this image in the bottom left-hand corner is they called the U.S. ships the Black Ships because they were black battleships and they looked ominous. And so they were forced to open up, and it actually led to eventually a civil war that has been immortalized in in things like Rurouni Kenshin and The Last Samurai, where eventually the Meiji government under Emperor Meiji overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate and reinstated a imperialist empire. That didn't go well for the U.S. because then Japan at that point was strong enough to tell the U.S. to go away. Then you had events called the Taiping Uprising and the Second Opium War, which were concurrent. The Taiping Uprising essentially began in 1856 and continued until 1865. And it involved an uprising led by a man whose name escapes me, but he believed he was Jesus's younger brother. I'm not making that up. That was his belief. Needless to say, he did not. The Western powers did not appreciate that, and also did not appreciate him trying to make a more powerful China. And they started a war with the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, called the Taiping Uprising. And what happened during that, what came the Second Opium War, where China asked Britain, France, and the U.S. for help, and they're like, well, we'll help you for more trade concessions. And China said, we can't do that. We're in the midst of a brutal civil war here. And the U.S. and France and Britain were like, well, tough luck. And they promptly invaded, destroyed a whole bunch of Chinese cities, and then forced them to sign other treaties like the U.S.'s treaty, the Treaty of Tianjin. And then the U.S. promptly sent a whole bunch of U.S. soldiers and then British soldiers and French soldiers in, including an individual known as Frederick Townsend Ward, who led Chinese militaries into several victories before dying and was deified. In fact, I can't prove this, but I have a feeling that this real historical individual was the inspiration for Tom Cruise's character in The Last Samurai, because they were very similar. Of course, unfortunately this was an actual real life case of a white person helping not people of color in a war, though it wasn't to the same degree shown in The Last Samurai, which was pure white savior horseshit.
Of course.
Yes. And so essentially the whole point of this is to show that the U.S. was always, whether it was with the Apaches, the Cherokee, Mexico, or China and Japan, was always trying to exert its imperialistic influence. And again,
up in everybody's business.
Yes, and again, this is not to take away from the main point of the video, which we'll get back to in a second, but it's important context that needs to be brought up, because often when people bring up the Indian Wars, it's like, oh, it's, the U.S. did it once and would never do it again. They didn't do it anywhere else. Yeah, they did. They did it right all over the place. And to say otherwise actually damages, at least in my opinion, the impact that happened to other people of color in the U.S., because if we assume it's just a one-time thing, then nobody cares, which is not how it should be.
Right.
So anyway, so now we're going into Victorio's War, which is a later Apache War. So I'll pass that off to my co-host again.
So Victorio is another one who, his sister was Lozen, who was my hero growing up. And he basically did a lot of raiding parties. And that was a lot of what Victorio's War was quick little bursts of fighting. Mm. and of course the U.S. didn't like him and didn't like that. As we established before, the other person in that photo is Nana, and Lauzon accompanied him on his raiding parties as well. Yeah, he was very, very skilled fighter. And he said that his sister, Lauzon, was his right hand in his fighting, and that she was a shield to her people. And it was said she had the power to find the enemy. But yeah, most of Victorio's war consisted of a lot of raiding.
And that makes sense. That's pretty characteristic of a lot of Indian wars. They were more bursts of raiding than actual pitched battles.
Yeah,
because that's a terrible idea to go against a more organized military. You don't want to face a more organized military in a pitched battle, because of course they're gonna, tear you to shreds. But if you face them in your home ground, then you have the advantage. So
right, like, so basically he would come down from the mountain. I think there's even a mountain named after him.
Okay.
He would come down from the mountains, quick attack, retreat back up to the mountains. And some of the lore surrounding him and his mountain actually includes, I'm pretty sure it's the same mountain. Some of the lore surrounding him and his mountain, it literally includes like Apache ghosts that at the mountain. I don't know if you've ever heard that lore.
I've heard that lore, and the hunt for gold there and such, I believe. Yeah.
I actually had somebody who is Apache ask me to do a video on it, and I'm really hesitant to do a video on it because I don't want to play into the magical Indian stereotype.
Yeah.
But because the guy who asked me, he's Mescalero, and he's like, oh, could you do a video on the Black Knights and which is what the ghosts are called, and Vittorio's mountain? And I'm just like, I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it.
I actually have a dog. I have a dog that I named after Vittorio.
Oh, okay.
But I started calling my dog Puptorio, and then it stuck. So my dog is actually named Victorio, but his name is Puptorio.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And did he ever surrender, or did he die in battle, or of old age, or
I don't remember how Vittorio died. I don't think he surrendered, though.
Okay.
I'm fairly certain he did not surrender, but I could be completely wrong about that.
Okay. And what about Nana? Did he? How long did Nana fight?
For a while.
For a while.
Yeah, they both fought for a while. I want to say Victorio was still fighting with Geronimo, but I could be wrong, and I don't have my computer handy to look it up.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, and I imagine they caused quite a lot of damage on the U.S.
Oh yeah, they definitely did, because they were, the U.S. was not used to guerrilla warfare.
No.
They were used to, planned, we'll be here at this date at this time, and then we'll fight, and then we'll all leave when we're done. And that's just not how Apache did things. And so they really didn't stand much of a chance against Apache war tactics.
Yeah. And so it was around this time that more Apache were beginning to be moved to reservations, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And I'm assuming it was very forcibly.
Yeah, very much.
And isn't that sort of the catalyst for Geronimo's eventual starting of wars? So.
Yep. Because he wouldn't stay on the reservation.
Yeah. And I know that the 1990s West Studi movie had it because of the ghost dance, but I don't think that's correct.
No, Apache didn't ghost dance. That's a Lakota thing.
Yeah, well, and funny thing enough, there was actually an earlier ghost dance during the War of 1812 that the Cherokee participated in, which is interesting as well. So it's a common tactic that
Now,
left at
I
some point.
I have seen one thing saying that um that they speculated that the reason why Geronimo started his wars was because he didn't have access to Sewin anymore,
Okay.
which I don't know if I buy that, because basically the article I read was calling him a drunk.
No, of course, yeah.
Because Tesiwin is a ceremonial drink that is made from fermented corn.
Okay.
So it is alcoholic, but it's used for ceremonial purposes. It's not like having a glass of beer. And he would have used it for ceremonial purposes.
Hmm.
But in our language, it's called kosbai.
Okay.
But I highly doubt that that's the reason why he did what he did, because that just doesn't track for me.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I agree, and there are often stories like that that just don't make sense. So yeah, there's that. So all right, the last slide I'm going to cover before we get into Geronimo's wars is the last little bursts of attempted imperialism by the U.S. outside of the continental U.S. before the coming of Theodore Roosevelt and various other uber imperialistic presidents. Though Theodore Roosevelt was and I use this term very loosely, the least imperialist of the presidents during this time, because he actually wanted the U.S. and Europe to stay out of China and other Asian places. But again, I use that loosely because he wanted to move into South America pretty almost immediately. But the
But wasn't he
U.S.
Philippines too?
Yes, yep. He wasn't president during the Philippine insurrection, but yeah, he did. He was president during that sort of holding of the Philippines. Um, so one of the first events, which is the image on the right, is essentially what happened is with Japan. Like I said, the U.S. forcibly opened up Japan under attempts to get beneficial trade sanctions from Japan, much in the same way that Britain did to China. However, Japan, having foreknowledge of events such as the Opium Wars and the Taiping Uprising, something which China could not have had because there were not similar events that had happened before it, was able to decide, no, we're going to plan accordingly, and was able to make the US and other European powers leave. So after that debacle, the U.S. decided we're going to try it again, and they sent a fleet to Korea and invaded and took several cities, and were like, "You're going to give us valuable trade sanctions." And again, it didn't work out. The Korean military never really engaged them beyond those few forts the U.S. took. They never got to the Korean capital, which was at the time in what is now modern day North Korea. So really nothing got anywhere. They took a few forts, and Korea was like, no, we're not gonna negotiate, and they failed. And then eventually in 1901 through 1905, an event known as the Boxer Rebellion happened in China, where in a similar way actually to the Ghost Dance, but not exactly the same, the rebellion, the people leading the rebellion, believed that if they did martial arts and wore specific uniforms and did specific chants, they would become bulletproof to the U.S. To the European guns. And of course, they did not. Now, this does not mean they weren't effective. In fact, they won quite a few battles. And eventually, the amount of battles they won against the Qing dynasty led the U.S., Germany, Britain, France, and various other European nations, including Russia, to form a coalition and invade China and forcibly put down the Boxer Rebellion. gaining even more valuable trade concessions out of China after this. There's a reason China was unfortunately known as the sick dog of Asia, because while Korea and Japan and such were actually doing quite well against the European and American powers, China was not, and that was due to a variety of factors, which I have every intention of making more in-depth videos about these, which is why I'm not going into too much detail. But essentially, they were in far from the height of their power during the emperors such as Kongzi and his grandson Qing Long, who had fought off Russia and various other European powers. So again, this is one of those things where the U.S. was constantly doing these imperialistic moves, even against Asian powers, not just Japan, because they were an imperialist power. They just weren't a fully fledged imperialist power. They were an emergent imperialist power. Because which is why when we get back into the Apache Wars, it's going to make more sense, because these were events they were trying and having mixed results at, and that's because they were often splitting their resources. It's hard to become an emergent imperial power when you're committing a genocide in your home country and fighting multiple wars within that country, and also trying to basically have a dick measuring contest with other imperialist powers across the world over who can get a hold of which Asian or African country. So,
Right.
So with that, we are now going to go into Geronimo's War, the absolutely most well-known Apache War section of the Apache Wars. I mean, we have the most well-known yell that people do when they're about to say jump off a trampoline or something is Geronimo. So why don't you? I'm gonna pass it off to my co-host, and why don't you tell us about Geronimo's Wars?
So Geronimo basically didn't want to stay on the reservation, and I don't blame him. So he kept leaving with his group of people, his group of fighters, and they kept leaving the reservation. So pictured here, so on the top left, we've got Geronimo. To his right is Townsend. Mm-hmm. To her right is Lozen. That is the only photo ever taken of Lozen. It makes me absolutely crazy all the time. You see pictures floating around the internet. There was one post I saw recently on Facebook calling her a princess and all of this BS, and with another person. And it even says in the photo of the person, the name of the person in the photo. And everyone's commenting, wow, she was beautiful. She wasn't a princess. She wasn't a magical being. She was an Apache two-spirit, which in that time, the two-spirit term didn't exist. She was an indigenous woman, and she was a warrior. Okay. Below Geronimo is Nechi. To the right of him is Goyen and her family. So these were all people who were with Geronimo and fighting with Geronimo. And so basically they left the reservation, which was, I believe, the San Carlos reservation, and went south into the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico. The U.S. Army, the Mexican Army were all chasing them. They were always one step ahead. They had a fairly large group, but our people are skilled in the mountains. So they knew where they were going. And because that's the other thing, is that a lot of American people think of Apache as an American tribe, a U.S. tribe. Our homelands traditionally also were in Mexico. Even that map you had earlier kind of showed it mostly in the U.S. Our homelands traditionally were in the northern states of Mexico as well. So we are not only a United States native tribe, we are a Mexican native tribe. He kept being one step ahead of the military. And like I said earlier about Lozen, it was said she had the power to find the enemy. And she was a very skilled fighter. Her and Townsend were always side by side in battle. Townsend did have a husband, but they were not very close. But as some historians would say, that Lauzon and Tadeste were, quote, companions, but they were very, very close in that way. And so then eventually they were captured, and many people chalk up the reason for their capture to, there was a woman who was about to have a baby. And Lauzon, also being an indigenous, is a very important role in our culture. An indigenous person is, like I said, what we would now call two-spirit. And it's two-spirit people are often medicine people, healers, warriors, a lot of different things. So her fulfilling her role as an indigenous person, she stayed behind to deliver the baby. And that's when they were captured. A lot of people believe that had Lauzon been with them, they would not have been captured. They don't fault her for their capture. However, many people do believe that they would not have been captured when they were, had she been with them. And there's another story about her where they were under fire, and that an important bag of ammunition was dropped. And that she was the only one who risked her life to go back and grab that bag of ammunition. And she came back unscathed, bullets whizzing past her, but she wasn't hit. So there's a lot of stories like that about her, where she like narrowly escaped death, but survived. She was an amazing woman. She's been my hero since I was a small child. So when they were captured, Geronimo was lied to. So he was told that if he surrendered, that none of his family or his people would be harmed, that they would be safe on the reservation, and, you know, that he would be prisoner, but that everybody else would be safe and fine and unharmed. But he was lied to. Instead, they were put into cattle cars and taken to Florida. So what happens when you take a bunch of Apache people from the desert and put them in a hot, humid climate? They get sick. So a lot of people started dying very quickly of tropical illnesses, malaria, also just heat exhaustion, because dry heat is very different from Florida heat. You put me into a jungle environment and I'm dying. I am sweating profusely. You put me in the desert, I am A-okay. So people started dying. Lauzon died of tuberculosis very quickly. And it was said that Tadeste mourned her for the rest of her life. She divorced her husband and never spoke English again. Tadeste did work as an interpreter prior to that, but she never spoke English again. And she lived until the 1950s, which really puts into perspective how recent this was. You know, a lot of people think of this stuff as long ago history, but Tadeste lived into the 1950s. Now, most of the people who were captured with him were able to eventually return. They were, you know, released from being prisoners of war, and they were eventually returned to the San Carlos reservation. Actually, I think Tadeste went to the Mescalero reservation. But Geronimo did spend the rest of his life as a prisoner of war. He did die in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Fort Sill Apaches are a thing. There was a group of Apaches that did stay captured in Oklahoma. They had babies. So Fort Sill Apaches are the group of Apaches in Oklahoma that are descendants of Geronimo's people. But yeah, so he was lied to. He even said that he regretted surrendering because, you know, and part of the catalyst for him leaving as well was not just him refusing to stay on the reservation, but also part of the catalyst for him leaving was his family was slaughtered. His entire women, his wife and children were slaughtered by the U.S. government and by the military.
Of course.
And so that's why he refused to stay on the reservation. And so yeah, that's Geronimo's War in a nutshell. And yeah, it lasted for a really long time. They were some of the last Apaches captured. My tribe never surrendered, but they were some of the last Apaches captured, and it did end very tragically for them.
Well, and a couple of comments I was going to say on that. For one thing, Lozen sounds like an Apache version of Nancy Ward. Uh,
A little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. A little bit.
Though to be fair, and this is an understandable questioning of some of the events she did, just specifically the Battle of Taliwa, is that the accounts of the Battle of Taliwa come like 10 years after she died and were talked about by James Vann, which most historians do tend to think it did happen, but that is a legitimate question. It's like, well, how much is it, is James Vann making it up or not? Because if you don't have any accounts, oral or otherwise, that until 10 years after somebody can say no, it didn't happen or not.
Right.
But like I said, I think it actually happened because it makes sense to happen. But yeah, so that's what it sounds like to me. And as somebody who has lost a child, I can definitely understand Geronimo's feelings behind that. Of course, mine were under very different circumstances, but I can definitely understand why that would lead him to not wanting to stay on the reservation. So
yeah.
So
I mean, I'm sorry for your loss. I have thankfully never lost a child, but having his entire family slaughtered, I completely understand.
Yeah.
Why he would do that too.
Yeah, exactly. So and there's that. And then like some of the battles that happened during Geronimo's War were like the battles of Fort Apache and Big Dry Wash. So like sort of like what was the events that happened in these battles? Like how did they go? And of course you don't have to go into super uber detail, but like generally how did they go? Were they victories? Were they losses? Or were they draws? Or essentially what happened? So
I mean, as far as I know, most of the battles during Geronimo's wars were either victories or draws. Okay. Either, they did their blitz attack and then yeeted, or it was a victory. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's sort of what I expected. Because again, the U.S. and European powers tend to be like, we won, when really they didn't. A similar thing happened in the Seminole Wars, where Zachary Taylor claimed he won a battle, but he lost more men, and the Seminole left the battle after they caused a whole bunch of damage and only lost like 10 men. So right. so yeah, that's sort of what I expected. I mean, there's a reason Geronimo was able to keep fighting for as long as he did.
Exactly.
So see here.
Now
oh no, you go ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna say they were, some of the last Apache captured, even though the Apache Wars did go on into the 20th century.
Yeah, and I know at one point George Crook, General George Crook, entered the war. Was that a turning point for Geronimo's War, or was it really just had no effect on on the war?
Yes, I believe that was a turning point.
Okay, he was very effective against the Apache war effort.
Yes.
What were some of the tactics that he used?
I've mostly studied the Apache side. As far as tactics that he used, he was just, I think, better at tracking them.
Yeah, and that I believe that's the case. I'm even less knowledgeable than you are.
Refreshing my memory here, he was just better at tracking them.
Yeah, and I'm sure he committed like burning villages and such, because that's the only thing the U.S. government knew how to do when they were losing wars.
Right.
And he is the one who eventually sent people to have Geronimo surrender, I believe.
Yes. And lied to him.
Yeah. So, and of course, we already talked about Geronimo's surrender. I see this picture that I used. He's in a European suit.
Yes.
Did he do that willingly, or did they? Because oftentimes people in reservations and boarding schools, as you know, very much more than I do, they would often force people to dress in European and American outfits.
So that's actually kind of funny when it comes to Geronimo. So as you can see, he's much older in this photo.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of these photos of Geronimo that were taken when he was old. And there's one in particular that's my favorite photo of Geronimo, where he's sitting in a car and the people sitting with him are wearing like war bonnets and breastplates, and he is wearing a waistcoat and a top hat.
So sort of like this picture.
Yeah, and the reason for that is because they dressed all the other guys up into stereotypical Indian costumes, but he got to pick what he wore.
Oh, and okay.
Top hat and waistcoat.
That's interesting.
And I just always loved that picture and thought it was so funny because that's why he was wearing that. So there are a lot of these photos of him at an old age, because he was much younger when he was captured. So there are a lot of these photos of him at a young age, or at an old age, where they're very staged photos. And there are some staged photos where he's wearing traditional Apache dress, some where they likely dressed him up, and then some where he got to pick what he wore. So I don't know if this is one where he picked it or if this is one where they dressed him up.
Okay.
So it's hard to know which one's which, you know?
Of course, yeah.
But yeah, the one I do know that the one in particular where he's wearing a top hat and a waistcoat is one that he picked.
Okay, well that's very interesting, and so that may be the case in this, because I mean, as with the case with the so-called 5 civilized tribes, because of course civilized is a very subjective term. You would see people like Stan Watee and John Ross wearing suits willingly like this as well.
At some point you should look up the photo of him sitting in the car.
Yeah, I'll look that up.
It just makes me laugh.
Yeah, well, of course, because then it's a way to sort of give the finger to people who still like wear war bonnets and such for Halloween. Like, well, look, here's one of the most well-known, if not the most well-known indigenous person who fought the U.S. military, and he's willingly wearing a waistcoat and a top hat. So
yeah, I love that picture so much.
Yeah, and that's often what happens in my work at the Van House, is people see people like Sequoia or John Ross wearing suits, and they're like, oh, but they're not wearing headdresses. Well, it's like, that's a very specific set of 5 tribes that would wear that. So yeah,
like we didn't wear that.
Yeah, exactly. So now
although I think Keay wore war bonnets.
Okay. Well, so I do know that the Apache Wars continued well after Geronimo's capture into the 1920s. Why don't you tell us a little about that?
So yeah, basically they continued into the late 20s, basically just trying to keep us on reservations. My tribe never got a reservation because we refused to surrender. Mm-hmm. So we're one of the tribes that does not have a reservation. We got a border wall instead. But yeah, there continued to be, there were smaller skirmishes after that. Like the last big one was Geronimo. Mm-hmm. But there were smaller skirmishes and fought in the same way of, coming down from the mountains with these quick guerrilla warfare blitz attacks. Up into the 20s, and some even say the 30s. And that's why we're the bad guys in all of the Clint Eastwood movies, as big scary Apaches. But yeah, so there were some smaller smaller battles and smaller wars that took place after Geronimo's capture, but they were much smaller.
Yeah. And did they just peter out, or did the U.S. military and Mexican military put concerted efforts militarily to put them down?
Both. It was both. Some of it just kind of petered out. Some of it was military efforts by the Mexican and American armies. And some of the tribes did surrender. Like I said, my tribe never surrendered, but some of the tribes did eventually surrender. And we're like, okay, we're done with fighting. It's been almost 100 years at this point. Let's just call it a day, you know?
Okay. All right. And so they officially ended somewhere between the mid 1920s and 1930s, essentially. Yeah. As you said, some people say the 1930s. So we'll give that a gracious time period and say somewhere in that 10-year period.
Yeah. Somewhere right around the time that my grandma was born. I know my great-grandparents were involved in the Apache Wars. My grandma was born in 29. So somewhere around the time when she was born or a toddler.
Okay. All right. So now, as we can see here, this is just a picture to give context. This is Geronimo, and I believe you said when we were going over planning this video, you said that these right here are Losing, or was it these two?
Yeah. So the woman in the okay, I'm trying to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from the right is Todd.
Okay, I see her now. I see Losing right there.
That's Losing next to her. So yeah, that's the only photo ever taken of her. Anybody who says there's another photo of her is lying.
Okay, and I believe that I'm pretty sure this is Geronimo right here. Yeah.
There's the other photo that I've seen attributed to being Losing a lot is a photo of a woman named Maddie Tom, who was one of Geronimo's people, but she was one of the people that was taken, you know, the Edward Curtis and Frank Reinhardt photos.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It was one of those photos, and for whatever reason, people like to attribute that to her being Losing, and there's a lot of mythology built up around her because she was a female warrior. And some of it's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that happens with mythological figures, and especially in the U.S., as we know, with indigenous historical figures, and one from the other. So now I do know that the Apache, like many indigenous peoples of the Americas, enlist in the military in large numbers, and they did participate in great numbers in World War I and World War II. So, you know, why don't you, will you please tell us about that? You know, what role did the Apache play in World War I and World War II? And for how long, and how a rough estimate of, like, was it a lot, was it a little amount, essentially that, along those lines.
So personally, I don't really understand why natives enlist in the military, because, like, I think it's per, like, you know, because we're only like 1.5% of the US population, but we enlist in the military in higher numbers than any other racial group. You know, and for me, I don't necessarily understand why, considering how the military has treated us over history. Yeah. I don't necessarily understand why we enlist in the military in such high numbers. I think, though, that it has to do with, historically speaking, we were warrior societies often. Yeah. And it's just a continuation of the warrior society.
Okay.
That's my guess. I do know that my dad always told me that we were not allowed to be code talkers because we were still considered hostiles to the U.S. military or to the U.S. government. But, you know, we were in World War I and World War II and the Vietnam War and every other following war after that. But honestly, I don't necessarily understand why Native people enlist in the military.
Yeah, and I personally don't understand why. I apparently my life is always, many of my closest friends are ex-military, and I don't get it because I would not have been able to listen to a drill sergeant yell in my face. But yeah, I can, I don't get it either. But they did definitely enlist a lot, and I find that really interesting that Apache were not allowed to be code talkers, and of course, as you just said, it's because they were considered still hostile. But that's very interesting, and that's still that sort of dichotomy, like going back to the Camp Grant massacre versus the Sand Creek massacre. You know, whereas like the Navajo, Muskogee, and Comanche, among others, were allowed to be code talkers, yet the Apache were considered too violent and too hostile to be code talkers.
There was, you know, Tlingit code talkers, there were Choctaw, there were, you know, Cherokee, there were Navajo, there were so many. Most people only know about the Navajo ones, but
yeah,
there were so many different tribes that had code talkers. But and even though our language is so similar to Navajo that when I hear Navajo spoken, I can pick up words here and there. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean,
like I said, though, if you think about it, though, like during World War I, the Apache Wars were still going on, and during World War II, they had just ended.
Yeah. Yep. And that's definitely the biggest factor. So yeah, but and you know, my whole point in showing this image and talking about this, and also as well as inviting my co-host here on, is the same thing I show in all of my videos about the Indian Wars, is to show that these people are still here. You know, my co-host is a Lapon Apache. They still exist, very much so. And they are historians in her case. They're military figures. They're her name is escaping me, and I apologize for this. The current head of the Interior. What's her name? Thank you. Yeah.
You know what? Wore on Inauguration Day, when she wore a ribbon skirt and her moccasins, I cried, because I remember I was about 5 years old, and I told my dad that I wanted to be the first lady president. And he said, nobody would vote for you because you're an Indian and you're a girl.
Yeah. Well, and now we have Deb Haaland.
And seeing her at the inauguration in her ribbon skirt, I was just, I cried, because I was like, the little 5-year-old in me that was so crushed when I was told that nobody would ever vote for an Indian or a girl. Yeah. It was so emotional.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the racism against indigenous peoples still goes on to this day. I mean, my mother was telling me, you know, my father and her have been many decades, have been separated. But she was telling me that when they were first dating, and they were going on a trip to Oregon and happened to come through South Dakota, they were getting ugly looks because he's Cherokee and very much not white. And the people were, they weren't outwardly racist, but you could see the hatred there. And then my uncle went and worked in Yellowstone in Wyoming, and he constantly faced racism because, again, he was very much not white. And so that's something I always try to bring up in these videos too, is that the idea that it's in the past is complete horseshit. It directly happened to my family, even though fortunately for my father and his siblings and most of his family, they were not forced to go into residential or boarding schools. They still faced this racism whenever they went out west. Of course, on the East Coast, there's not as high populations of indigenous people, so a lot of people just don't know, I mean, what they actually look like. They know stereotypes they've seen in fucking John Wayne movies. So
yeah, like when I was, so the first time I ever experienced racism was when I was 5.
Mm-hmm.
I lived in Indiana, and somebody told me to go back to Mexico. They were an adult. I was with my dad,
Huh.
and they told us to go back to Mexico. And I was really confused because I had never been to Mexico, and my dad had to explain it to me.
Yeah.
And you know, when I was living in Indiana, most of the time I would have people who would just automatically speak Spanish to me. And like just assume that I didn't speak English because they thought I was Mexican. But you know, out here in Oregon, you know, I'm definitely clocked as native.
Yeah.
But you know, living in Indiana was a lot different in that regard.
Yeah. Well, and you're in the state that I believe you mentioned in one of your TikTok videos that mural in Parks and Rec is the kind of murals that exist there.
No, Indiana is that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You talked about how because Parks and Rec is set in Indiana, and here like those murals exist.
Oh yeah, I mean literally when my aunt died. Okay, my aunt died last November. The funeral home that we went to literally had all over. It's because it was in Lafayette, Indiana, which is where Pontiac, the Battle of Tippecanoe and Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, all of that. That's Lafayette, Indiana. Prophetstown. Okay, that's Lafayette. The funeral home that we went to for my aunt's funeral, in the room where they have where families can go.
I have one of those.
The walls were covered in pictures and paintings of massacres of Native people.
Yeah.
I was like, whose idea was this for a freaking funeral home?
Yeah. That's that's unfortunate. And that's unfortunately sounds somewhat par for the course for some of the towns here in Georgia. So luckily the towns I live in currently, the town I live in currently is literally right down the road from New Echota, the capital of the Cherokee Nation, and 20 minutes away from my job, the Chief Fan Museum. And we really work hard to not because they're sister sites. They're run by the same they're run by the same ranger. There's a main ranger and an interpretive ranger, and the main ranger runs both of them, and he works really hard. He and the interpretive ranger work really hard not to have that. In fact, we emailed the artist who had before the interpretive ranger, who's my boss now, started working there in the root cellar. They had bought a piece of artwork for the barrels that were supposed to represent where the whiskey and brandy were held, and it says Drunk Joe Man on there. And she emailed and like, look, we need to change this because it creates a it brings forth a negative stereotype of Native Americans / American Indians that we don't need to have.
Yeah.
You know? So, but not every historic site does that, unfortunately. And that is definitely the case. All right, so well, that ends our video. And as always, like I love to say to my viewers, you know, if, you know, have you learned any of this in school? You know, did you or did you not learn it to a certain degree? Because of course we live in a country where the Trail of Tears is like a paragraph at most in most textbooks, and Wounded Knee and Camp Grant are never mentioned, if or hardly ever mentioned, if mentioned at all. And then, you know, like, share, and subscribe. And thank you to my co-host for coming on and bringing her knowledge of these events that, again, I am lacking, because it's just, you know, historians is we're both historians. Well, I'm an archaeologist, but she's a historian. But as we'll both attest, historians and archaeologists tend to focus on specialty regions. There's not a historian like, say, Herodotus or anything like that anymore, where it's like, where I'm just going to ramble about the history of the world and hope I get something right. so
Right.
so thank you, Laura, for coming on, and everyone, I hope you have a good day.
Hidden, thank you for having me on.
Mhm.